I say it casually, war crime, war criminal, but these are pretty loaded terms. Briefly explain what they mean to the average observer versus in a legal context, a legal setting.
Sure. So war crimes are among the four major international crimes, so the most serious crimes that the global community has decided need to be outlawed, along with genocide, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. So as you said, it's pretty serious stuff. And essentially it means violating the laws of war in the most serious fashion. So a serious violation of the laws of war is a war crime.
Okay, now almost immediately after Russia attacked civilian targets, and I'm thinking of the hospital complex, the maternity ward in Mariupol, MSF called the action a war crime. The U.S. has been a little bit slower to take this up. President Biden finally eventually called Putin a war criminal. Let's take a listen. You know what? We don't have it, but what he does say is, I think he's a war criminal. So he kind of makes it clear that this is his personal opinion rather than the opinion of the U.S. government. This is even as the Senate passed a resolution condemning Putin's alleged war crimes. Why is the U.S. so cautious on this?
Well, they're being cautious because for it to be a war crime, attacking a hospital, for example, would have to be deliberate, right? So attacking a hospital, the kinds of casualties we've seen of civilians in the streets and elsewhere, residential buildings, if those are intentionally targeted, that's a war crime. Now, if those targets are hit incidentally while a legitimate military objective is being targeted, so let's say the Russians were trying to aim at a Ukrainian military post, and they incidentally hit some civilians, that may not be a war crime. So the caution is about the evidence not being in and an investigation not having been carried out, which would conclusively show that there was a deliberate and strategic targeting of those objectives.
Okay, so in a court of law, what would prosecutors have to show to prove Putin's criminality?
They would have to essentially show that he ordered those strikes or that he gave general directions that civilian targets should be made the target of strikes, or alternatively, that he authorized indiscriminate attacks. So attacks that didn't discriminate between a military objective, which can be targeted in war, and a civilian objective, which cannot. So he would have had to either intend those targets to be hit or to have known that they were likely to be hit, with almost complete certainty following his direction.
So that brings the next question which is what are the vulnerabilities, the legal vulnerabilities of individual Russian commanders that Putin has in his military versus President Putin himself? Does the law distinguish between someone instigating and masterminding and directing a war crime versus someone who's carrying it out?
All of those people at the different points you've mentioned can be found guilty of that war crime. Now, it can be harder to prove people at the top of the pyramid, right? Because unless you find the written instruction, that can be a lot harder than tracing to the person who actually physically launched the attack. But generally, certainly the International Criminal Court would want to take the people at the top of that pyramid. So while everybody that you mentioned down the chain of command is potentially liable for the crime, the International Criminal Court and other states that might want to prosecute these things would generally try and find the people most responsible, so higher up the chain.
You mentioned the International Criminal Court. That's obviously one venue, one body that might be able to investigate possible war crimes in the in Ukraine. Who else, what other bodies, what countries might be taking the lead in investigating this?
Well, actually, any country is empowered to investigate and prosecute war crimes wherever they occur. And that's because, as I said at the beginning, a war crime is an international crime which carries with it something called universal jurisdiction. I don't want to get too technical, but what that means is actually any country who is party to the Geneva Conventions, and that's every country, has undertaken to look for and prosecute anyone thought to have committed war crimes that they find on their own territory. So what this means is that, and it will come down, of course, to political will, but any country who wishes to start an investigation of Putin or any of the generals or people lower down the chain of command is empowered to do so. And that might have the effect, for example, of limiting the travel of those people quite significantly, because they could be potentially arrested in almost any country around the globe.
Okay. Is that the path that the United States might take, given that the ICC, which is based in The Hague, is not even officially recognized by the US, which kind of presents its own awkward situation?
Yes, it's interesting. The US has been more enthusiastic about the ICC, right, the International Criminal Court, in this current situation. Now, the International Criminal Court does have jurisdiction over these current goings on in Ukraine. So the International Criminal Court can and is investigating this situation. I mean, I've seen signs that the US is considering supporting those investigations, that it thinks that that is an appropriate venue. Of course, it would be very hard for the International Criminal Court to get its hands on Putin, for example, or presumably any of the senior figures, because they're likely to stay in Russia. And it's similarly hard for any other country to get their hands on them if they stay in Russia. So as I said, one primary effect might be really to limit the travel of anyone who could possibly be charged with war crimes in connection with the conflict in Ukraine.
Would the ICC or any other multilateral body like that be able to try Putin in absentia?
No, the ICC does not have jurisdiction to try in absentia. Some countries do, of course, around the world, and they might potentially proceed with those prosecutions, but the ICC cannot try in absentia.
Is there a statute of limitations for someone who's been accused of instigating or carrying out war crimes? I mean, does this expire after a certain amount of time?
That's a great question. No, there is not. So war crimes are the exception to statute of limitations. All international crimes, there is no statute of limitations. And we've seen, of course, individuals being prosecuted many, many years after the event for acts during the Holocaust or in Nazi Germany. And that's an example, an expression of this basic rule that there is no statute of limitations on war crimes.
What if Russia turns around and accuses Ukraine of war crimes? Do prosecutors of the ICC or any of these international bodies have any obligation to follow up with an investigation into that?
Oh, absolutely. That's what they will be doing. So the ICC has jurisdiction to investigate in Ukraine, and it investigates the situation. It doesn't investigate a particular party. So it will be trying to understand what's happening on the ground, and it will be being as even-handed as it can be in terms of investigating all the crimes that were committed there. Of course, it will be focusing on the most serious crimes. And certainly from the reports that we've been seeing in the media, that looks like most of them are going to be on the Russian side. But it's not excluded that Ukrainian individuals could also find themselves under investigation.
Okay, thank you. That's an important point to remember. So looking ahead, Kate, what do you see happening in the next couple of weeks here when it comes to all the condemnations of Russia and Vladimir Putin as a war criminal and as committing war crimes?
I mean, it's very interesting. One thing that I think has been noticeable is that accusation of war crimes does have some purchase. So we've seen, a very violent rejection of that from Putin. So that's, in an interesting way, a kind of affirmation that they do take that qualification seriously and that they do not want to be seen as war criminals. So in a way, that gives us some hope in the value of the law, even as it's being violated. As I said, it might be that that there's a concerted attempt to look into war crimes in a way that would limit the travel of Putin or individuals in his chain of command. And the third interesting development is that this may see a renewal of interest and faith in the International Criminal Court, also from the US authorities, who, of course, have been somewhat distant in recent years.
Would the US end up recognizing the ICC, you think?
I think that's a way off myself. I think that would be wonderful. I think that would be a really important gesture for the US to make, and a commitment to international law and to preventing atrocities around the world. But I think that's a step that's unlikely to come in the near future. I do think that United States support for the court, however, is likely to increase, and I think that could also be very helpful.